She whispered a secret I wasn't supposed to hear, but I promised her, even the walls wouldn't tell. I remember the first time I stepped into that old apartment building, the kind that creaked under your footsteps, where the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and something older, something like a memory. The hallway smelled of lavender, dust, and sunlight filtering through tall, narrow windows. It was quiet, but not empty, the kind of quiet that made you notice the little things, the soft hum of a distant radiator, the gentle whistle of wind through a cracked window, the way light pooled on the worn carpet in golden rectangles. And then I met her. My landlady. She was standing at the top of the stairs, holding a set of keys in one hand, her posture graceful yet casual, like she had moved through this building 1,000 times and still noticed every corner. Her age, maybe early 40s, was visible not just in the fine lines around her eyes, but in the calm authority in her movements, the ease of her presence. She smiled at me, a quiet, knowing smile, and for a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down around us. "Welcome," she said, her voice low, soft, and warm. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like she could make a statement without raising it above a whisper. And then she leaned just slightly closer, almost conspiratorially, and murmured, "Don't tell anyone." The words hung in the air. Not a demand, not a warning, more like a shared secret between two strangers who suddenly weren't quite strangers anymore. I felt a strange thrill, the kind that makes you want to lean in just to hear more, to understand why this ordinary meeting carried so much unspoken weight. I handed back a small smile, trying to match the calm elegance she carried effortlessly. "Even the walls won't hear it," I replied softly, almost automatically, and for a moment I thought I saw the faintest flicker of surprise cross her face, like she wasn't used to someone meeting her in that same quiet, deliberate way. She handed me the apartment key, her fingers brushing mine just briefly, a contact that was light, almost accidental, but it sent an echo through my chest that I wasn't expecting. My heart felt a little faster, not from fear, not from awkwardness, but from curiosity about her, about this place, and about whatever secrets this building seemed to hold. By the time I had carried my boxes up the stairs and set my bag down, I already knew this wasn't going to be just another rental. There was something in the quiet, in the way she moved, in the hush of her voice and the warmth of her gaze, that made the apartment feel alive, and made me wonder what it would be like to belong here, even just a little, by her side. Settling into the apartment, I started noticing the little things, small glimpses of her life that seemed to reveal more than words ever could. She moved through her routines with a quiet elegance that made ordinary tasks feel almost poetic. One evening, as I passed her apartment door while returning from the corner store, I saw her arranging a small bouquet of flowers on the windowsill. The way her fingers hovered over each stem, adjusting just so, made me pause. It wasn't perfection she was after, it was care. I realized I had begun watching her from doorways, from the edge of the hallway, without even thinking about it. How she hummed softly while she dusted the shelves, a melody so gentle it felt like it belonged to the quiet itself. How the sunlight caught the strands of her hair, giving her a soft halo that seemed almost unreal in its warmth. And every now and then, she would glance up, just briefly, as if sensing me there, but not in an accusing way, more like a fleeting acknowledgement that someone noticed the rhythm of her world. There were moments that made me acutely aware of how human she was, how beautifully alive. One afternoon, she handed me a letter that had been mistakenly delivered to my door. Her hand brushed mine, almost accidentally, but the touch lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. There was warmth there, subtle, comforting, and somehow intimate, though neither of us said anything about it. My heart thudded softly in my chest, a quiet echo that matched the rhythm of the apartment around us. Sometimes, in the evenings, I'd catch her by the small kitchen window, leaning slightly on the counter, staring out at the street below. Her expression was calm, yet there was a hint of longing, maybe memories, maybe just the reflection of her own thoughts. I wondered what she was thinking, what stories she carried with her in those quiet moments. And I realized that I was drawn not just to her presence, but to the spaces she occupied, the warmth of her apartment, the softness of her voice, the invisible trail of her life that lingered in the air like fragrance. It was strange, this growing awareness, how someone could feel so close without a word being spoken, how a glance or a gesture could communicate more than any conversation. Every small movement, every sigh, every subtle smile seemed to pull me in, weaving a connection I hadn't expected. I found myself looking forward to these glimpses, to the quiet rhythms of her life, and to the tiny, unspoken intimacy of watching someone live so gracefully, so fully, that it made me wonder if perhaps even walls could feel the pulse of a soul. And in that quiet observation, in those fleeting, almost accidental moments, I began to understand, this was no ordinary landlord-tenant relationship. Something deeper, unspoken, and utterly compelling was beginning to form. It was a rainy evening when the first real, unplanned conversation between us happened. I had been fumbling with the faucet in the bathroom, an old, stubborn fixture that seemed determined to resist my attempts at repair. Water sputtered, dripped, and finally sprayed me squarely in the chest. Cursing softly under my breath, I heard her knock gently at the door. "You're going to flood the place," she said, her voice calm but with a teasing edge that made me grin despite my frustration. When I opened the door, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, carrying a small toolbox as if she had expected this exact scenario. Her presence filled the cramped space with warmth, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the faintly metallic smell of water. She knelt beside me to tighten a loose pipe, and our knees brushed. Just a fleeting touch, yet it lingered in my mind, carrying a surprising weight. She laughed softly at my clumsy efforts, and it wasn't mocking, it was light, understanding, patient. Then, as we worked side by side, something shifted. She paused and, almost without thinking, shared a small piece of herself, a memory of a past tenant, a story about a forgotten letter, a subtle mention of loneliness she hadn't voiced aloud before. It wasn't dramatic, nothing the world would call a confession, but in the quiet intimacy of that room, it felt monumental. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and I leaned in slightly, instinctively, as if our closeness could make the words more tangible, more real. "Don't tell anyone," she murmured again, a phrase I had thought I understood the first time, but now carried deeper meaning. I caught the tremor in her hands as she tightened the wrench, the slight flush on her cheeks as she glanced up at me. I responded instinctively, softly, "Even the walls won't hear it." The words weren't just a promise, they were a recognition of the trust she was offering, fragile and precious. Our eyes met, and in that silence, we communicated something words never could. A shared understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that boundaries were being tested, gently, safely, and with care. That night, as the rain continued against the windows and the apartment smelled of damp wood and faint lavender, I realized something profound: trust could be built in quiet, almost accidental ways. A touch, a glance, a shared secret, it was all part of the slow rhythm between us, a delicate dance of closeness that didn't need labels. And as I watched her gather the toolbox and retreat down the hallway, I felt the first real pull of connection, the gentle tug of a bond forming in those small, intimate moments, unseen but deeply felt. It started as a simple task, rearranging the living room to make space for a small shelf I had bought. She had offered to help, of course, though I wasn't sure if it was polite concern or genuine interest. Either way, when she stepped into the room, the sunlight from the window caught the subtle highlights in her hair, and I noticed the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the warmth of the afternoon air. We moved together naturally, as though we had done this before. She lifted one side of the shelf while I held the other, our hands brushing against each other more than once. Each accidental touch sent a small jolt through me, not startling, but insistent, a quiet reminder that our proximity carried weight. She smiled slightly, almost shyly, and I caught her glance lingering on my face longer than necessary. When we leaned close to tighten screws and adjust the shelf, I became acutely aware of the sound of her breathing, the subtle warmth radiating from her arm as it pressed lightly against mine. I wanted to say something, anything, to acknowledge the pull between us, but words felt clumsy, inadequate. Instead, I let the silence speak, letting the small, tender details, the brush of fingers, the tilt of her head, the faint tremor in her hands, carry the weight of unspoken emotion. At one point, our knees brushed beneath the shelf, and we froze for a heartbeat, our eyes meeting with an unspoken question. Neither of us moved, and in that stillness, a quiet tension wrapped around us, gentle but undeniable. It wasn't lust, it wasn't urgency, it was something deeper, something that asked for patience, for attention, for awareness of every small, intimate gesture. As we finally stepped back to admire our work, I noticed how she lingered a moment longer than necessary by the shelf, her gaze sweeping the room and then meeting mine. Her lips curved in that faint, knowing smile that had already begun to feel like a promise. I realized, then, that moments like this, the subtle brush of hands, the shared laughter over a crooked shelf, the quiet pauses where our shoulders almost touched, were laying the foundation for something I hadn't expected to feel. Walking back toward the hallway, she paused and let her hand linger on the doorknob, a fraction of an inch closer to mine than needed. It was a silent invitation, an acknowledgement of the connection we were cultivating, however quietly. And I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that intimacy wasn't always about grand gestures, it was in these fleeting, almost accidental touches, the soft rhythm of two people slowly noticing each other, and the warmth that lingered long after the moment passed. It started with a note slipped under my door one evening. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably hers. Tea. Tomorrow evening. Just the two of us. My chest tightened with a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. I had spent weeks observing her, learning the rhythm of her life, and yet this private invitation, felt like stepping into a world I hadn't been allowed into before. The next evening, I arrived with a small bag of freshly baked scones, feeling strangely nervous despite knowing her so well. The apartment was transformed by the soft glow of a single lamp in the corner. Shadows danced gently along the walls, and faint music played from an old record player, the notes soft, intimate, almost like a voice whispering secrets meant only for us. She greeted me at the door with that calm, graceful smile, and I noticed how her eyes sparkled in the lamplight, reflecting something deeper, unspoken, a quiet longing, a gentle vulnerability. As we settled at the small kitchen table, the space between us felt charged, yet safe. Steam curled from the teacups, mingling with the faint aroma of her perfume and the warm scent of baked scones. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, yet every word seemed to carry more weight than usual. She spoke of small dreams she hadn't shared with anyone, of fleeting regrets and moments that had shaped her. I listened, my attention absolute, noticing the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup absent-mindedly, the soft pause when she searched for the right word. At one point, our hands brushed over the edge of the table. It was almost accidental, yet intentional in the way it lingered. The warmth of her skin against mine sent a quiet shiver through me, a gentle reminder of the intimacy growing between us. We didn't speak of it, we didn't need to. It was understood in the lingering glance, the slight tilt of her head, the way her lips curved in the smallest, knowing smile. As the evening wore on, I realized that this moment was not about grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was about the quiet sharing of space, the intimacy of presence, and the slow unfolding of trust. In her apartment, under the soft glow of the lamp and the gentle music, I felt a connection I had never anticipated. A bond that was as much about silence as conversation, about lingering touches and shared glances, about the warmth of being seen and understood. When I left that night, the echo of her voice and the weight of her gaze followed me down the hallway. I knew that this invitation was not just about tea, it was an opening into something deeper, something tender, and something neither of us had yet dared to name. And I couldn't wait to return. The air in the apartment felt heavier that evening, though it was still quiet and calm. The rain had stopped, leaving the windows streaked with faint rivulets that caught the soft light of the street lamps outside. We sat on the sofa, a small blanket draped over our knees, the space between us just wide enough to feel cautious but close enough to notice the warmth radiating from each other. I had been wrestling with my thoughts all day, the pull I felt toward her, the way my chest tightened when she laughed, the ache of wanting something I wasn't sure I could name. And now, finally, I found myself speaking, my voice low and deliberate. I feel drawn to you, I admitted, letting the words hang between us. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the blanket. I could see the hesitation in her posture, the careful way she avoided meeting my eyes at first. And then, slowly, she lifted her gaze, meeting mine with a softness that almost made me falter. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, yet steady. "I feel it too," she confessed. "But, there are so many things to consider. The age difference, how people might see us. I'm not sure if we can, navigate this." Her words didn't push me away, they pulled me closer. There was a vulnerability there, a willingness to share her fears without judgment, a quiet honesty that made my chest ache with tenderness. I reached out, my hand hovering over hers for a moment before gently covering it. The contact was deliberate but careful, warm and grounding. She didn't pull away, instead, she let our fingers intertwine slowly, like a silent negotiation of trust and closeness. We talked then, softly, about what we wanted and what we feared. The conversation was intimate, but not in the way words alone can convey. It was intimate in glances, in pauses, in the small touches that lingered just long enough to leave an impression. I noticed the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her eyes glistened in the dim light, the slight quiver of her lips when she laughed nervously at her own honesty. In that quiet exchange, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only this, only us, sitting close, hearts exposed in ways neither of us had planned, but both of us had longed for. Hesitation mixed with desire, fear mixed with longing, creating a tension that felt electric yet gentle. And as we rested our hands together, fingers laced, I realized that confession wasn't the end, it was the threshold of something deeper, a slow-burn intimacy that neither of us had to rush, but both of us had been waiting for. The apartment had grown quieter over the weeks, but in that quiet, there was a new warmth, a rhythm that belonged to the two of us. The space no longer felt like a collection of walls and furniture, it felt like a world we had quietly built together. Every corner, every object, every faint scent of lavender or baked bread carried a memory of shared moments, small touches, and lingering glances that had grown into a steady, comforting intimacy. That evening, she invited me to sit beside her on the couch, a soft blanket draped over both our laps. The rain had begun again, tapping gently against the window, a soothing soundtrack to the calm intimacy surrounding us. She rested her head lightly on my shoulder, her hair brushing my chest, and I felt the warmth of her presence seep into me. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, there was no rush, no need for words, but it carried more meaning than anything that could be spoken aloud. We talked quietly, about the mundane things, the small joys and little frustrations of our days, but in every sentence, every pause, there was a depth of connection that hadn't existed before. Her hand found mine, fingers brushing and then settling together, warm and familiar. Each touch was deliberate in its gentleness, a silent language we had been developing over weeks of shared glances, laughter, and whispered secrets. Sometimes she would adjust the blanket around our shoulders, her fingers grazing my arm in the softest way. Sometimes I would brush a stray strand of hair behind her ear, noticing the small tremor of her smile when our eyes met. These gestures were subtle, YouTube-safe moments of affection, but they carried all the weight of unspoken desire, of trust, and of a bond that had grown slowly but undeniably strong. We sat like that for hours, sharing warmth, presence, and quiet laughter. The apartment felt alive, not because of decoration or light, but because of the intimacy between us. And in that intimacy, I realized that this relationship was about more than just attraction or curiosity, it was about safety, understanding, and the joy of being seen by someone who truly noticed you. Finally, as the rain softened outside, she lifted her head slightly and looked at me, eyes reflecting the gentle glow of the lamplight. I could see the trust, the affection, and the quiet joy that had grown between us. I smiled back, and for a moment, it felt as if even the walls were leaning in to witness our connection, though they held our secret faithfully. In the end, we didn't need words or grand gestures to define what we shared. We had found something rarer, the warmth of slow-burn love, the quiet intimacy of hearts meeting gently, and the comfort of knowing that even the walls wouldn't hear it, but we would feel it, always, together. If this slow burn story warmed your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another tale of quiet love, tender moments, and unexpected connections. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment touched you the most.